I'm sure your parents were probably like mine when they said, you know, there are three things you don't talk about in public, and that's race, religion, and politics, with race being the first instance. It's not an easy conversation, but it is an absolutely necessary one, not just for us as lawyers, but for me and my colleagues in law enforcement as well. And I'll tell two stories to illustrate that. I shared this story at lunch. Recently, my wife and I took our three kids, who are ages 9, 11, and 13, to see the movie about Jesse Owens, Race. We saw it a couple weeks ago. My wife and I enjoyed it. It's not the greatest movie, but we were inspired by the story about what transpired back then. And we came out, and we were talking about how great it was, and we asked the kids, what did you think about this? And they universally said, it was awful, it was terrible, we hated it. And I said, why? And they said, it's all about black people and black issues. And I looked at my wife, who's African American, and I looked at my three kids, who are African American, and I said, but you're black. And they all said, well, it doesn't matter anymore. We don't need to talk about it. We need to just stop talking about it and move on. They were not comfortable with the conversation and with the issues that were brought up by the movie. The second story goes to a defendant recently released from prison outside of San Francisco. He had gone in the mid-1970s for a violent crime. As he was driving across the Golden Gate Bridge to go to prison, the bridge was shut down by protesters, and this is in 1975, 1976, who were protesting police misconduct, particularly against minority communities. And they had to maneuver through this protest that had shut down the bridge before he could get to prison. He went to prison for 40 years. When he came out of prison, he was driving back across the Golden Gate Bridge, back into San Francisco, and members of the Black Lives Matter movement had shut down the bridge, protesting police misconduct, particularly against minority communities. And he relayed the story how he just broke down in tears because he felt nothing had changed in the 40 years that he was in prison. So these are uncomfortable topics, but they're relevant, particularly in terms of perception. And perception matters. There is a perception that certain communities are policed differently and more harshly than others, and that when police or other law enforcement agencies are shown to have engaged in some misconduct, that those officers are not held accountable. There's a perception that our criminal justice system is not working properly, and perception matters. And that's why about 4 years ago, a group of U.S. attorneys formed a racial disparities working group, which I chair, because we felt it was important to address those perceptions. I think some of those perceptions are real, but I also think some of those perceptions are misperceptions, and it was important for us to drill down on what was actually going on so that we could answer questions. And I would get questions as a U.S. attorney: is this an epidemic of shootings, of police shootings? Are we at the highest level ever of unarmed people being shot by police? Is this racism? What's going on? And I couldn't answer the questions because we didn't have data. We didn't know exactly what was going on. We had a lot of anecdotes across the country, but we didn't know. So we formed this working group 4 years ago, and we've met periodically over the last 4 years. We've met with academics, we've met with public defenders, with prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, all types of people to get information and try to get this data. And then we made recommendations to the Attorney General, recommending changes that could address these perceptions and hopefully improve belief and restore trust in the criminal justice system. And I'm proud to say that several of those suggestions have been taken up. They include dialing back the use of mandatory minimums and restricting them to the top-level drug dealers, for example, and not the girlfriends and the mopes and other folks. We recommended that there be an actual study of sentencing, similar to what the Sentencing Commission did, I think 4 or 5 years ago, but something more updated to look at what has happened since 2005 when the Booker decision was handed down. What has happened in terms of sentencing disparities, if any? We thought that it was important to document that and analyze it so that it could be published and reviewed and acted upon. And sure enough, the report came back last fall and showed that there were discrepancies among black and white defendants when you if you hold the criminal activity or the crime the same and you hold their criminal history the same, there are discrepancies that have actually increased since 2005. Interestingly, there aren't discrepancies that were found between black women and white women. For whatever reason, sentencing discrepancies did not exist there since 2005, but they have grown for men since 2005. The study did not explain why, but I think the conversation we're having today takes a step in that direction. I think there's a lot more to be done to investigate these problems, but the first step is actually doing them, taking those steps and drilling down. So the judge asked, is this important for prosecutors? It's absolutely important for us because, as the judge showed and Professor Wald showed, everybody is impacted by biases, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, we all carry them. And the great thing about implicit bias is it's measurable and not necessarily entirely fixable, but you can improve it. You can do something to reduce it. And I asked recently on a panel similar to this, is this implicit bias stuff, is this just like diversity? There was a big move for diversity 10, 15 years ago, and then diversity turned into inclusion. And isn't this just the latest fad towards addressing racial issues in this country? And what I was told and what I believe is this is different. This is scientifically provable, and it is possible to address the biases that we all share, which I think is absolutely critical going forward. And it's critical for the Department of Justice to do what we're doing. And I say that because I went to a conference comprised of district attorney representatives and state prosecutor representatives, and room probably about 150 people. And I asked the question, how many of your offices are addressing implicit bias through training or developing training programs? And I would say out of that 150 people, 4 people raised their hands and said that we're doing something about it. So I'm hoping that the Department of Justice taking this step, saying it's an issue, saying it's a problem, will help lead other prosecutors' offices to do the same thing. We're not at the very front. Cy Vance in Manhattan, John Chisholm in Milwaukee have gone even further and actually did an in-depth study of their offices, a 2-year study each, using the Vera Institute of Justice to look at each point, discretion point that prosecutors had to determine and analyze to see whether race impacted any of their decisions. And they were then able to go to the communities that they represented and said, they could say, this perception is accurate and this is what we're doing to fix it. This perception is inaccurate and this is why. They actually had the data to back up what they were doing as prosecutors, which I think is critical to us being successful going forward. So I'm going to conclude there because I know we don't have a lot of time and I think we have questions. But my basic plea is we all need to lean into the uncomfortable. As I said in the beginning, this is not necessarily an easy conversation, not a pleasant conversation all the time, but it's absolutely critical that we engage in it from a prosecutor's perspective because I do believe the credibility of the system rests on us getting it right. Thank you very much.